The CNN studio lights blaze as tension filled the air, and Jason Chaffetz, the former Utah congressman turned Fox News contributor, sat across from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with his signature smirk already forming, believing he had the perfect trap set. After all, this was a man who had grilled Hillary Clinton for hours and made careers crumble with his congressional investigations. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave Chaffetz speechless and create the most viral political moment of the week. A clip would later circulate on Twitter declaring that Congressman Chaffetz had just tried something that backfired spectacularly, and that what Jasmine Crockett said next ended the entire segment, leaving him with absolutely no comeback. This was not just another political debate. It was a moment a rising Democratic star proved why underestimating her was a mistake even seasoned. Politicians like Chaffetz should avoid the stage was set for what Chaffetz thought would be an easy win, but he was wrong, completely wrong. To understand why the confrontation was so explosive, one must know exactly who was sitting across from each other that night on CNN's primetime show at 57. Jason Chaffetz had built his entire post-congressional career on being the man who asked the tough questions during his tenure in Congress from 2009 to 2017. He served as chairman of the House Oversight Committee, turning congressional hearings into must-see television drama grilling. Secret Service directors, IRS commissioners, and most famously Hillary Clinton during the Benghazi investigations after leaving Congress, he secured a spot at Fox News, becoming a regular contributor on shows like Fox and Friends, and Hannity. His brand was simple, to no-nonsense conservative who could make Democrats squirm with rapid-fire questioning. He wrote books, gave speeches, and built a media profile around holding Washington accountable, but what made him truly dangerous in debates was his mastery of the gotcha moment. Armed with statistics, old quotes, and carefully crafted traps, he could put opponents in impossible positions. He was not simply debating, he was prosecuting, and he rarely lost. Across from him sat 43-year-old Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, and had Chaffetz done his homework, he would have known he was stepping into a political buzzsaw. Crockett was not a typical freshman Congresswoman. Before coming to Washington in 2023, she had been a civil rights attorney in Dallas who took on police departments, and one with a law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. She had spent years in courtrooms going toe-to-toe with prosecutors and judges. She was not easily rattled, and her true strength came from combining her legal expertise with social media savvy in 2024 politics. She understood that the real battle was often won in the viral clips that followed a confrontation. She knew how to deliver a line that would be shared millions of times. Since taking office, she had already made waves, calling out Republicans for fake outrage during hearings, going viral for her pointed questions in the Trump investigations, and building a reputation for never backing down from a fight, no matter the experience of her opponent. This was not simply two politicians having a discussion. It was a clash between two approaches to power in Washington, with Chaffetz representing the old guard that valued mastery of procedure and institutional experience, and Crockett embodying a new breed of political force built for both the hearing room and the internet battlefield. Political games would always win out, and Jason Chaffetz embodied the establishment, even as conservative, because he knew how the game was played, while Jasmine Crockett represented something entirely different, a new generation of politicians who understood that the rules had changed and that social media had democratized political communication, where a perfectly timed response could reach more people than a 10-minute floor speech, and where authenticity often mattered more than credentials. A topic they were debating only heightened the stakes as they discussed the ongoing investigations into various Trump administration officials, a subject where both parties held deeply entrenched positions. Chaffetz, as a former oversight chairman, defended the Republican position that Democrats were engaged in political witch hunts, while Crockett, as a current member of the House, argued that accountability was the very purpose of oversight. Beneath the policy debate lay a bigger question: whether the old way of doing politics, Chaffetz's way, was still effective, or whether politicians like Crockett had discovered a new playbook that could neutralize traditional tactics. Chaffetz believed he had the perfect setup, having studied Crockett's committee performances and convinced himself he had found her weakness in her passion, an occasional fire which he thought he could exploit. His plan was a classic Chaffetz maneuver: ask a series of detailed procedural questions about oversight rules, push her into a defensive position, and then spring a trap with a question about her own committee conduct. It was the same formula he had used successfully for years, and he had even tested some of his lines on Fox News the week before receiving nods of approval from hosts who assured him Crockett would be out of her league against someone with his experience, but Chaffetz made a crucial mistake. He was prepared to fight the last were the kind of debate that worked in 2015, not the kind that dominated in 2024, and Crockett was about to show him exactly what that meant. The cameras rolled, the lights blazed, and both politicians prepared to make their case to the American people. Chaffetz had his notes, his practice expressions, and years of experience, while Crockett carried something entirely different. The debate began exactly as Chaffetz had planned, with CNN host Anderson Cooper introducing both guests, and Chaffetz immediately taking control of the conversation with the confidence of someone who had done it hundreds of times before. Anderson, what we are seeing from House Democrats right now is exactly the kind of partisan overreach Americans are tired of. Chaffetz declared in a familiar authoritative tone before adding that Congresswoman Crockett had been one of the worst offenders the camera cut. To Crockett, who sat calmly, her hands folded, listening with the deliberate focus of a lawyer studying opposing counsel, waiting for the mistake rather than preparing an emotional retort, but Chaffetz pressed on, pulling out his rapid-fire questioning style and asking, in your committee hearings over the past 6 months, how many Republican witnesses have you called and how many have you allowed to present their full testimony without interruption? It was a signature move, asking for specific numbers most politicians would not know offhand, yet Crockett's response came instantly and with precision. Congressman Chaffetz, in the Oversight Committee alone, we have had 12 Republican witnesses in the past 6 months, 7 of whom were given unlimited time for their opening statements. Would you like me to name them? The studio fell momentarily silent, and Chaffetz's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. This was not the vague bipartisan answer he had expected. She had called his bluff with hard facts, but as a veteran, he pivoted quickly, saying that from what he had seen of her performances, she seemed more interested in creating viral moments than conducting true oversight, and TikTok videos are not the same. As serious legislative work was the attack Chaffetz believed would land as he tried to frame Jasmine Crockett as a social media politician more interested in likes and shares and real governance. It was a kind of generational critique that had worked for him before against younger politicians, but this time Crockett's posture shifted ever so slightly as she leaned forward, her voice calm, but with sharpened edge, saying, Congressman, that is fascinating coming from someone who left Congress to become a TV pundit. And since you brought up oversight, let us talk about your record during your time as oversight chairman. How many Trump administration officials did you actually hold accountable, and how many subpoenas did you issue to investigate potential corruption? The question hung in the air like a challenge. And while Chaffetz's face tightened, he pressed on, insisting that he had conducted oversight based on evidence, not political theater, unlike what Democrats were doing now, where committees were weaponized for partisan gain. This was where Chaffetz thought he would spring his ultimate trap, having researched Crockett's committee questioning style and believing he had found inconsistencies in her application of parliamentary procedure. He leaned in with theatrical precision and asked, according to House rules, specifically Rule 11, Clause 2J1, committee chairs are required to provide how much advance notice for witness testimony, and have you been following that rule in your recent hearings? It was a classic gotcha question, a specific rule citation most would not have memorized, meant to make her appear unprepared, but instead of fumbling, Crockett smiled and asked, Congressman, are you referring to the 72-hour rule for witness testimony or the 48-hour rule for document submission? Because if you're going to quiz me on House rules, you should probably make sure you are citing them correctly. First, the color drained from Chaffetz's face as he realized he had misremembered the rule and that she had corrected him publicly with calm precision, proving she knew the rules better than he did now. Clearly frustrated, he abandoned his careful script and went for a more personal attack, saying she was a freshman member who had barely been in office 2 years, trying to lecture people with decades of experience, a mistake that turned his outsider brand on itself. Crockett's reply came immediately and with devastating simplicity. Congressman, you are absolutely right that I am newer to Congress than you were, but I am still here, and you are not. So maybe the American people did see through something, just not what you think. The studio went silent, and even Anderson Cooper looked stunned, but Chaffetz pressed on, accusing her of making smart aleck comments instead of engaging in substantive policy discussion, claiming serious people in Washington could not take her committee work seriously. And then he went for what he thought would be his knockout blow by questioning her committee conduct and suggesting she cared more about social media clips than getting answers for the American people. It was meant to put her in her place with procedural knowledge and moral authority, but instead it set the stage for one of the most devastating responses in recent political memory. Crockett's voice dropped into the unmistakable tone of a skilled attorney, preparing for cross-examination, as she asked Congressman Chaffetz, since you want to talk about committee conduct and getting answers to the American people, let me ask you something during your time as oversight chairman, when you had the power to investigate potential corruption in real time. Where were you? Before he could answer, she continued, where were you when the Trump administration refused to comply with congressional subpoenas? Where were you when tough questions needed to be asked about conflict of interest? Where were you when the American people needed a real watchdog, Where you were congressman, you were on Fox News getting paid to defend the very administration. You should have been investigating Chaffetz tried to protest that the attack was unfair, insisting he had served with distinction and integrity, only for Crockett to cut him off with a pointed "did you?" Because from where I am sitting, it looks like you abandoned your duty to the American people the moment it became politically inconvenient before. Driving the knife deeper by saying you want to talk about social media clips and political theater. You literally left Congress to become a television personality. You traded your gavel for a makeup artist, and a teleprompter Anderson Cooper fought to maintain his composure. But even he seemed to recognize he was watching a verbal demolition in real time. Chaffetz, now flushed and rattled, made a final attempt to claim the moral high ground, saying the American people could see what kind of politician she was, and that grandstanding like hers was why Congress had lost respect. But in doing so, he handed Crockett the perfect setup. She looked at him with the calm confidence of a lawyer about to close a case and said, Congressman Chaffetz, respectfully, you did not get to lecture anyone about serving the American people, pausing just long enough for maximum dramatic effect before delivering the two words that detonated in the CNN studio. You quit. The silence that followed was absolute. The words now carried even more weight as Crockett spoke. You did not lose an election. You did not get voted out by the people. You quit. You abandoned your post, walked away from your responsibility, and then got a job criticizing people who stayed to do the work you could not finish. Chaffetz's mouth was literally hanging open, and for perhaps the first time in his entire political career, he had no response. The man who had built his reputation on always having the perfect comeback, the devastating follow-up question, the moral authority of the oversight chairman, was sitting there in complete silence. So, no, Crockett continued, her voice now rising with the confidence of someone who knew she had just delivered a knockout punch. You do not get to question my commitment to this job. You do not get to lecture me about accountability. And you certainly do not get to criticize my conduct as a member of Congress. She leaned back in her chair, her point made with surgical precision, because at the end of the day, Congressman, I am still here doing the job, and you are here getting paid to talk about it on TV. Anderson Cooper looked back and forth between his two guests, clearly recognizing that something historic had just happened on his show. The camera stayed on Chaffetz's face for what felt like an eternity in television time, maybe 3 seconds, but it was long enough to capture the exact moment when a political career gets redefined. Chaffetz finally found his voice, but it was weak and defensive in a way that viewers had never heard from him before. Congresswoman, I left Congress for personal reasons, family reasons that I think anyone can understand, he stammered. It was a wrong response, weak, defensive, and worst of all, it sounded like an excuse. Crockett did not even need to respond. She just looked at him with a kind of expression that said, really, that is what you are going with. The silence stretched for another moment before Anderson Cooper, recognizing that this segment had reached its natural conclusion, stepped in and said, we are going to have to leave it there. Congressman Chaffetz, Congresswoman Crockett, thank you both for joining us tonight. But everyone watching knew that this was not really